All right, everyone, welcome back to FIU in DC. I hope you're enjoying your day so far between your interactions here and around town, and it's the first of a very exciting 3 days on a topic close to FIU, Defense and National Security Technologies. For those watching online, which will be nobody quite yet, but who might be watching it later after the fact as this stays archived, this panel discussion is a corporate panel discussion that is part of a 3-day fly-in with students from across majors, across levels, that are exploring from both a technical and policy angle how new technology, especially in the national security and defense spaces, gets developed, gets implemented, gets funded. So to that point, we have two policy-oriented individuals from two relevant organizations here with us today, which we couldn't be more thankful for. I'll give you their names and titles. My first question kind of gets into what they do, so I'll let them provide more context than that about what they're doing. But we have Amy Smith. Amy is the Senior Director of International Operations and Policy at Boeing. And we have Chris Boyer, who's the Vice President of Public Policy on Cybersecurity at AT&T. So thank you both for being here. My first question is rather straightforward, and will provide more context to our group about what you're working on and what questions they might be able to have for you later on. Is what are your responsibilities in your current role, and what major projects or initiatives is your team currently working on? No particular order.
Happy to. Well, it's good to be with you guys today. This is the DC daytime version of double fisting, the coffee and the mic. I'm hoping, since this is a small group, that we can make this a little bit conversational. So as we talk, we were talking about this, feel free to just put your hand up if you want to, it's not interrupting, we'd rather have you guys ask questions in real time. I'm actually an FIU alumni, and I do anything Carlos asks me to do because he and I were actually in college at the same time. I'm hoping he doesn't tell you how long ago that was, because that would really age both of us. I moved to DC right after I finished at FIU, and I think we're going to get into more of our history, right, the background conversation later. But as the Senior Director for International Operations and Policy at Boeing, my job is to run the international commercial activity in DC for the company. What that looks like is I have responsibility. I have a team of people that work for me that have responsibility for all activities that we care about at the State Department, at the Commerce Department, at the Department of Transportation as it relates to international issues. I deal with anything on Capitol Hill that is internationally focused, trade, sanctions, foreign military sales. I have a counterpart on the international team who does defense international, and so he happens to be the person who would go into DOD or the State Department if there was a focus on something military, one of our defense platforms. But I am the only person on our international team that is a registered lobbyist, so I go to the Hill even for him if there's a defense issue. So if sanctions, you've probably seen there's a lot of news these days about sanctions legislation moving on Capitol Hill. That would be me regardless of what the nature of the concern from the company was. I go to the Hill if it's a foreign military sale that Congress has to clear. So that's basically my portfolio. It's a lot. I've been at Boeing 7 years, and we'll talk more about how I ended up there and how I ended up in this job. But these days it's a little bit quieter because we don't have as many commercial aircraft selling internationally because we're not in the Department of Commerce and in the State Department and around town asking the government to help us sell the 737 MAX, because it wouldn't really be appropriate to ask for government assistance in that regard while the plane is grounded. So happy to answer more questions about that. I can answer questions about the MAX in my sleep at this point, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
While you bring that up, Amy, can I ask you from a...
Sure.
They can ask questions from a technical company standpoint. Can I ask how personally, how it's been being in your role as the company goes through this situation?
It has been a learning experience. I think when this is over in a few years, when things have stabilized, I will say that I was very grateful for the chance to be in the situation and to learn what a corporate crisis looks like from the inside, both what to do and not to do. Right now, it just feels like I'm in the eye of a hurricane. And it's been a very, very rough road for most of us. My portfolio in particular has been bloodied up pretty good. My background on Capitol Hill before I got to Boeing was commercial transportation policy on the regulated. I worked for the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. So when this happened, I did spend a lot of time with the commercial regulatory team. I was loaned to them to do a lot of work on the MAX on the Hill, and then eventually when that I don't want to say that stabilized. It's never going to stabilize. But when we got to a point where the commercial team didn't need the extra bodies and I stepped back into the international role, my job is to try to deal with the customers, our international customers who are very angry because they have aircraft that are grounded or they had aircraft they were expecting to have delivered that are parked in Renton that they haven't been able to access or fly. And my team is spending a lot of time thinking about what we're going to do when when our software update gets certified by the FAA and we're flying again. My team will be dealing with the aftermath of the international customers, many of whom are owned by governments overseas. We'll have to manage those relationships and probably be at the table or be involved in healing the wounds of settlement negotiations, because most of them are suing us, and we'll get some sort of settlement, but most of them won't get as much money as they're all going to come to the table and think they deserve. And, in some cases, we have open-ended questions to answer with them involving how many aircraft are you going to keep in the skyline that you had already committed to? What does this look like? And everyone is going to be different. Everyone's going to be its own unique animal. And so I imagine we have a wave of chaos and activity coming on the horizon after we're back in the air.
Thank you.
Great. So my name is Chris Boyer. I'm with AT&T. I'm actually was invited to come here today by a colleague of mine, JC Flores, who's an FIU alum, and I work very closely with him on a wide range of issues. My responsibility at AT&T is I have responsibility for our cybersecurity and technology policy portfolio. And so the way that we're organized is I work in what's called the Global Public Policy Organization. That's a part of AT&T that works for AT&T Corporation. So we work for the holding company. So if you think of AT&T, everybody thinks of us as a mobility operator who provides mobile services. But we actually recently purchased Warner Media. So we own Warner Media, which includes assets like TNT, HBO, a lot of content stuff, and then we also have an advertising affiliate called Xandr Media. And so the public policy organization is under the corporation. The corporation owns all those different affiliates, whether it's Warner Media or the traditional, what you would think of as AT&T and the communications networking side. And what we do is our job is to basically develop AT&T's corporate policy positions on different issues affecting the company that are before government. So whether it's things like copyright protection, which is a really important issue for the Warner Media subsidiary, very interested in people that are trying to do different things involving content, or things like you've probably heard of like the net neutrality debate that's gone on for a number of years. That's really important to the communications company. I spend most of my time working on security and 5G related matters, which are very timely right now. So we kind of sit in the middle of that, and our job is that we're not actually a lobbying organization. We are we're supposed to be the how would you say, the corporate subject matter experts who work with our business units really closely and then works with our frontline organizations here in DC to develop our policy positions. And then we talk through, and then we go meet with government officials as subject matter experts. So I spend a lot of my time talking about cybersecurity with, or very similar to your role, like in places like the Department of Homeland Security, with the intelligence agencies, with DoD. We've been dealing a lot in the last year on 5G related matters and what to do about 5G supply chain concerns that you've probably read about in the news. It's been widely publicized. So we're dealing with a lot of issues there, so I spend a lot of time dealing with that. I also have a team that reports to me that handles cybersecurity globally. So we interface a lot with foreign governments as well. So interacting with I was just in Paris like 2 weeks ago at the OECD, meeting with them to talk about cybersecurity issues, Internet of Things. So a whole range of technology issues that we're trying to manage there on the AT&T side, and really just I would view our role largely as building a bridge between the technology and the policymakers. And if you spend a lot of time in DC, and a lot of these policymakers, in particular when we're talking like on Capitol Hill and other places, they're not spending their whole day thinking about like what to do about like 5G deployment or Internet of Things security. And so what we're really trying to do is come up with sensible policy solutions to those problems that we can advocate, with the agencies and with folks on the Hill and all of government, including overseas with foreign governments as well. So that's really what we do. So.
Right. In terms of national security, what roles and responsibilities do companies play, both in yours, but broadly speaking, the private sector? What's the relationship between the government and private industry in this area? And I'll throw in, based on the conversation you've had so far, which both of you mentioned foreign governments as customers, does that as a client base affect that answer in any way?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Take this first.
Yeah, I'll go first. For us, it's pretty simple. If you think about national security, especially when you talk about like cybersecurity or network resiliency, we own the communications infrastructure for the areas that we serve, right? So AT&T, Verizon, we generally operate most of the communications infrastructure. So communications in the United States is a private sector function. It's not a government function. The government doesn't own and operate the networks. So when you talk about network resiliency or recovery, we operate a lot of that infrastructure. That ties into national security. So we have a role to play in terms of ensuring that our infrastructure is secure, that it's not going to be affected by cyber attacks, that it's not going to be, you guys are in Florida, so you've probably seen this, that we have resiliency programs like what we call network disaster recovery programs to deal with things like hurricanes that come through, flooding, a whole range of different issues. So we work very closely with government on those issues. The way the government deals with critical infrastructure security is the Department of Homeland Security is generally the lead in that, at least for our sector. They divide it up into, it gets complex, but they're for each sector of the economy, they have what's called a sector-specific agency that kind of coordinates critical infrastructure security and response. And for communications, it's DHS. So we work very closely with the Department of Homeland Security on resiliency efforts, whether that is things like ensuring that we have, access to necessary capabilities. So like if we have a hurricane that hits and we need to get in resources like say battery generators for our cell sites, or fuel to power the generators, or we need to get our crews in to repair the lines. Like that's all stuff that we work really closely with FEMA and DHS on. And we have a range of other activities that we do that's similar to that in the cybersecurity space. So we have a lot of partnerships with government to ensure that in the event of a bad day that we have the ability to respond quickly and keep the network up and running.
There's a couple seats up here, guys. Everybody's kind of hanging out in the back if you want. Boeing is, this is a huge issue for us, and we're also unique in that we obviously have some cutting-edge defense technology we sell as well as our commercial aircraft, and even commercial aerospace is the prime example of a dual-use military-civilian technology dynamic, right, where we have to get government approval for a lot of our, when we develop a new aircraft or when we're looking to sell to a customer. There's a reason why we're not allowed to sell aircraft to Iran. I'll give you a real-time example of something I'm dealing with. China wants us to do more manufacturing there, shocker. And of course, for the company, we have to weigh whether or not we're willing to expose a certain amount of our intellectual property in order to gain access to that market and sell aircraft. It seems like a no-brainer when you think, well, anything you move over there is going to be stolen. We know this. But at the same time, China represents 25% of the civilian aircraft market. So to not have access to that market creates a dilemma. And we're often in a competition with Airbus to see who's willing to put more on the line, who's willing to give up more IP in order to gain access to that market. So these are questions that we're constantly fighting over. We have an entire team of technical experts inside the company. We call them GTC, Global Trade Controls. And anytime we're dealing with an overseas customer, GTC has to take a look at everything that we're talking about in terms of technology to make sure that what we're about to sell that customer is something legally we're allowed to sell them. And sometimes we get pushback as government operations. I've had people come to me and say, well, can you get this changed? Because this customer doesn't seem like it should be a threat, and we would really like to have access to this market. Most of the time, the answer to that is no, but it's sometimes a conversation. What is the wisdom of this? Do I think that lawmakers would feel differently if they understood what this was, how it's being used? Is it possible that, there's just a technical glitch here that this would even be captured? So, yes.
I have a question about the kinds of Boeing prices. How did that affect you personally? Did you consider leaving Boeing, and did you have kind of your own mental, things when that happened? Not guilty, because obviously you don't work with that, but
Sure.
Yeah.
I love that you asked that. It's a great question. I really did struggle with it. I struggled in the immediate aftermath. My thought wasn't, I wish I want to leave. My thought was to hunker down and actually think, this is what they hire us for, right? This is the moment when government operations is going to save the company. But I will admit that I've been very frustrated with how my company has been able to react to the crisis. I'm going to say, I'll say this on the record, off the record, I think in the end, when people look back at this and look at what really happened, people aren't going to feel like Boeing was the only cause of the 2 accidents that occurred. We had a technology issue that was a factor, but when you look at the accidents holistically, there will be more discussed outside the realm of MCAS, if you guys were following that from a technical perspective. And I believed that in the moment, but I struggled a lot with the corporate reaction and how the company behaved. And I will admit I was one of the people who was thinking, I wonder how long our CEO is going to hang in there, because this feels very sterile. Our reaction felt sterile and uncomfortable. And a lot of us that worked in GovOps had trouble explaining that to the people around DC that we needed to deal with. And me going to the Hill, that was really difficult. And, Boeing is a company of engineers. And I don't know if any of you are engineers, if any of you have engineering background. Love you guys, you make the world turn, but some of you aren't the best at communicating with people. And this is where GovOps comes in, is, hey, rather than hand me a 25-page PowerPoint, can we get this down to 3 pages, and can it be in English, please? And so dealing with taking engineers to the Hill, trying to explain the crisis, was its own dilemma in and of itself. And there were days when I went home and, there were days when I went home and said, I don't know how long I can do this if this continues, if the pain continues at this level. And then eventually, fortunately for me, it kind of stabilized before I reached what I would consider my threshold, where I was able to say, all right, I can deal mentally with where we're at right now with this. I think I have another wave of this coming. I think the company is going to struggle with dealing with the cleanup and the settlements, and I may have another wave of agitation of how we're managing it. I've seen a little of it. I mean, we definitely have some places where we've made progress and others we haven't. But, I think there are a lot of my colleagues that are chewing on this. Obviously, the company's taken a really big hit, and it's not so much that people aren't proud of the products we make as much as it is, what does the future of Boeing look like for the next 5 to 10 years? If you're in a company, especially when you're, Carlos, forgive me for saying this, middle-aged. I haven't told them the year we graduated, by the way. We're going to keep that under wraps, yeah. When you're in my age demographic and you're looking at where your career is, you have an idea of where you're headed. And if you realize the company may contract, it's something you're going to stop and think about. Well, what, am I still on the track I want to be on? What does that track look like? And I think a lot of people are soul searching right now, trying to figure out what that looks like. Sure. You want to take that first, or?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, so a lot of, in our situation, it's a little bit unique in that we're not a defense. Well, we are a defense contractor, and we're not. Like, we provide communication systems to the government, to the defense agencies. We don't sell them military grade. I would consider like military equipment, right? So we're dealing mostly with communications network platforms. We do work with them from time to time on issues that come up. Usually there's a government-led process to do something like that. So there's always concerns when you're talking about commercial communications networks about whether or not you would voluntarily turn over subscriber information. There's a lot of privacy concerns that are involved there. So typically what happens is the government, if they have a specific need of something they need us to do, they will get a court order from, through an official judicial process, and then we'll work with them in that regard. But we do provide technology to places like the DoD and the intelligence agencies. But we're the underlying network for them. Like, what they do on top of that, that's really their business. So there's a lot of classified programs. Like AT&T is one of the vendors of what's called the Einstein cybersecurity solutions, also called E3A, which is basically a box that DHS maintains that they put in government networks, where it's effectively what I would call an IDPS, an intrusion detection and prevention system, where they route traffic through that, and we host it. because we provide the underlying network communications for that, but we don't know what they do with the IDPS. Like that's completely managed by DHS, and it's classified what they're doing with that. So in a lot of ways, we're more on the end of, hey, we host the network for the government agencies. They can put what equipment they want to put on top of that. That's up to them, and if we do anything involving outside of like serving the government, if we do things involving AT&T customers, which is the 110 million mobile subscribers that we have, and all the consumer products that we offer, typically that requires a judicial process where they'd have to go through a court and provide a validation for them to do anything.
So my answer to that, I'm obviously not a technical expert in this area, but I'll give you a real world example of that where it affected me in my job as the international commercial, as someone who screens everything international. A couple months ago, something came across my desk, and Boeing has this innovation cell called Horizon X, and it's kind of a place where you're a little bit separated from the business, so you can do some JV investments and work on technology and innovation that doesn't have a profit and loss associated with it in the short term. And they came and they were looking to do something with DJI, which is the Chinese drone manufacturer. If any of you have been tracking this in the news, they're pretty controversial for a lot of reasons, mostly because it's believed that even the smallest drones that are being sold to recreational users are basically charting and graphing everything, and it's all going back to servers in China, and it's a way of mapping the globe very effectively because a lot of people are flying these things around. So, I got this put in front of me. Is this okay? All right, well, what I'm going to do in that capacity is I'm going to call DHS. Turns out DHS has been the lead organization working on this and said, hey, can I get a TS level meeting with you to talk about DJI? Did the meeting, came out, called my friends at Horizon X and said, I don't think you should do this. If you want to know why, send me someone with a clearance and we'll go into a skiff and I'm happy to explain it. And they said, nope, that's fine. As long as we've covered this and you have had the briefing and you tell us we shouldn't do it, I'll stop. And that was the end of it. So that's where I see it. I mean, I know that we get, hacking attempts into our system over 100 times a day from China, from, foreign actors. And I think that we are very sensitive about protecting our IP. From a technology perspective and how we go about that, I'm definitely not the right person, but that's a window of what my world looks like where it crosses into those issues.
Yeah, I was a little remiss in saying that, that's a really good point. We do a lot of, so we have 3 buckets, right? There's the consumer bucket, which I was talking about earlier. There's the government contracting bucket that I talked about. But the other one is we do a lot of cyber threat indicator sharing with the government on a more voluntary basis. We're not talking about individual, it's not done at the individual level, it's more at the aggregate level that we see things like different cyber attacks going on. A good example of this would be right before, if you're a cybersecurity geek, you know what the Mirai botnet is, but 2 or 3 years ago, when we started, before the Mirai botnet even got into the news, we saw a big influx of different port scans that were going on IoT devices, and our security team put together a report. We went over to DHS, we went in a skiff, we talked to them about it and explained what we were seeing. We shared that with the FBI. So we do some of that when we see kind of aggregate level things happening on the network. A lot of what we do on the network is we look at it, we monitor it 24/7. So we'll see unusual things that are occurring at a large scale on the network. And what we can do is take that information, and we do at times share that with government when we think something unusual is going on. If we have a big enterprise customer of ours, for example, like a bank, and we're seeing a bunch of data being exfiltrated from the bank's network to Russia or someplace like that, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll notify the bank. We'll tell them we see this activity going on. Then we'll work with the bank whether they want to bring in the government to deal with that. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes, I think, in the cybersecurity realm that's really at the enterprise scale. It's really not about individual consumers. I'm always really careful about this because I don't want to get people thinking that the Big Brother is watching you kind of thing. I'm really talking about technical data information where we see specific big, our network. We have about 300 petabytes of data goes across our network a day. So your individual email traffic is irrelevant to us. It's so big that it's like a needle in a stack of needles, right? We would never know what it is. But if we see somebody exfiltrating large scale files from a US bank, that's a totally different issue, and we can actually monitor for that. And that's a lot of what we would do as a service for our customers, but we can also work with government on those types of activities.
Hi, so I have 2 questions. One for Annie, one for Chris. We know China right now is the biggest threat for business. They try to track the economy, a lot of stealing, IPs. So question for Annie. So last year, Chinese revealed like they built this plane called C919.
Comac. Yep, the Comac
from
919.
Company.
Mhm.
And it sounded like this was like a very long term campaign between 2010 and 2015, and they stole IPs from companies in the US, Germany,
Airbus,
and
since they were
France.
building stuff over there.
Yes. So do you think like you feel like that's a big challenge, a very national security like enemy for that?
So I personally don't think it's a national security issue as much as it is an aerospace competitiveness issue. I think our company would say it's only a matter of time before they come online with an aircraft that is marketable globally. They're definitely behind the curve, both behind the curve where they want to be and well behind the curve of either Boeing or Airbus and having an aircraft that could be certified and safe. They've stolen a lot of that IP for sure. A lot of it came from Airbus having a final assembly facility over there. We would, when we look at our skyline and we look at our business strategy commercially, we often are asking ourselves, is there room globally for 3 major OEMs in the narrow body and wide body market for aircraft? And I think that when we're doing that analysis, it's some of the reason you've seen Boeing move into partnering and doing a JV with Embraer, and it's some of the reason you've seen Airbus try to partner with Bombardier, because we realize that one answer to that is to diversify our fleet and have more offerings than, our stall, which is one reason the company's hurting. The best aircraft we have in terms of the market is the 737. It hits the sweet spot of what most airlines globally want, size-wise. And, we're marketing a lot of wide bodies overseas right now, the 87s, the 777Xs, but that MAX line, that 737 line, we were producing 47 aircraft a month off that line. It was our workhorse line, and that's where Comac's trying to hit. So I think the question is, how soon do they have an aircraft that could actually be internationally certified? And that's still a big question mark. And the company's going to have to decide, do we accept that they're going to be part of the marketplace? And if we do, are there business opportunities in that? China may need more aircraft than they're capable of producing for themselves. The Asian market is so big. And if that's true, then partnering with them on services something that we might want to consider down the line? Or are they too big a competitive threat to want to go down that road? And those are questions that are bigger questions than I'd have answers for, or I think even the company's prepared to answer yet. And of course, for Boeing, fold into that, we also sell defense products. And it's great to say, hey, we really care about selling commercial aircraft in China until they're building fake islands off the South China Sea and they're shooting at aircraft carriers and trying to take down the F-18 Super Hornets that we also built. So our company's a little bit schizophrenic in that area, and it's an interesting spot to watch the debate for me.
I could offer one comment on that, is that we might be, I can't speak to aviation specifically, but we might be a few years ahead of where the aviation industry is, because we're dealing with that issue right now when it comes to communications infrastructure. So, for 20 years now, Huawei has been kind of building up their capabilities in the communications space, kind of starting out that way, right? They were basically copying what Cisco did. Mm-hmm. Cisco was manufacturing routers in China. Huawei, frankly, was, and they've been widely accused of this, there was a lot of intellectual property theft going on, I think, is the general consensus. And they were able to effectively build out their business that way. And so what started out as kind of a small business where they were just trying to get in the space and be competitive with other manufacturers, they are now the world's largest provider of telecommunications equipment. They just recently surpassed Ericsson, who was the largest. So Huawei and ZTE, another Chinese company, have over 40% of the telecommunications infrastructure now. So if you view companies like AT&T being similar to like what an airline service provider would be in your industry, we're looking at who are our vendors right now, and we have basically 3 major vendors for mobile network communications, which would be Ericsson, Nokia, and Huawei. And Huawei is we're not allowed to use them in the United States. They're prohibited by law. So we're left with Nokia and Ericsson, and those two companies, frankly, are struggling to compete with Huawei. So where the national security angle comes into play is will the U.S. be stuck with, will our networks not be permitted to use cutting edge equipment because we'll only be allowed to use equipment manufactured by two companies like Nokia and Ericsson that don't have the wherewithal to compete with China. And if you look at China's 2025 initiative, they are throwing tens of billions of dollars of investment to make to make themselves the world leader in a lot of these critical technologies. So in communications, started out that Huawei was small, that they had a price advantage. They now make equipment that frankly is very competitive with the rest of the world technologically, and they spend probably 2x what all the other vendors combined spend on R&D. So we're in a situation where there's a lot of concern, I think, in the U.S. government, and this is what I spend most of my day dealing with right now, is what strategies do we have to create a more competitive supply chain long term that can compete with what's going on in China? What do we do about, we have Nokia and Ericsson as two suppliers. We have Samsung that's trying to get into the business, but they're just starting out. How do we spin up more U.S. supply? So we went from a situation where we had dominant U.S. providers to a point where the Chinese suppliers now dominate the market, and we're trying to flip the tables on that and bring in more supply. And I think that's an issue that I think my industry, in some respects, is the case study for that. It's like the first one that's dealt with this challenge. But I think with China has such big ambitions that I think it's likely to be an issue for other industries as well.
So you mentioned earlier that engineers are not good at necessarily communicating. You ask them to retranslate everything to English. Can you elaborate more, talk more about the difficulties of taking these technical terms and trying to translate them into good policy at Capitol Hill? Because as we know, sometimes they're lost in translation can lead to bad policy and therefore bad results.
Truth. There's a reason they pay me a lot of money. It's because it's not an easy thing to do sometimes. To me, I look at it and I think, I have to remember that because I'm exposed to Boeing and the engineers on a regular basis, my level of understanding of what they're trying to communicate far exceeds what the average Hill staffer is going to understand. So, I'm oversimplifying this, but when we round up a couple engineers and we have to go to the Hill, I'll use the MAX as an example. If we're going in to meet with committee staff, they are also subject matter experts. So, you kind of can say, just cut loose, but be prepared to, walk back a little bit, spell out your acronyms. I'm going to flag you if I think you're getting too in the weeds or if the committee staff look irritated. But when you go into personal offices where staff have to be more generalist, I tell them you got to talk as if you're talking to somebody who is maybe in their first year of college and is brand new to this subject and doesn't understand anything you're talking about. And, we work on that with them. If we're in there and it's a crisis situation, we'll make them brief us and can continue to interrupt and correct them until they mentally adjust to what level they need to be briefing at. And even then, it's a challenge. I had issues with that. When I took engineers up to the Hill on MAX, I'd walk out of meetings and a lot of times the staff or the member would have been quiet. And then afterwards, I'd get a follow-up that was like, I didn't understand a lot of that. Can you explain what this is? We never did get an understanding of what this acronym is. And so for me, part of my job is just being accessible as a go-back in the event that happens. For me, a lot of times it's also taking slide decks away from them and telling them this is unacceptable. Like, if I can't understand it without you explaining to me when I look at it, it doesn't work because this is a leave behind and you're not going to be there to explain it to them. So.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time, at least on the AT&T side, trying to translate the technology issues to things that they'll resonate with people that don't spend their day thinking about telecommunications policy, right? So that's a big challenge, but that's kind of what our jobs are. Like, I think you were saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Like my job in DC is largely to be a subject matter expert, but I have to translate, from. This morning I was talking about 5G supply chain and what's called open radio access networks. Guess what, try explaining that to your average member of Congress, right? So trying to get our engineering lead, our chief technology officer and a bunch of his engineering team, taking that and translating that into something that we can use for several meetings that we're going to be doing up on Capitol Hill. And so it's a challenge, but you got to, they're really smart people. It's not that I'm not trying to be negative towards them. They're doing the best they possibly can, but in a lot of cases, they have so so many issues they're trying to deal with. The committee, you're right, the committee staff is generally the experts that we're talking to, so we can have a one-on-one kind of expert-to-expert conversation, but you know, when it comes time to look at a piece of legislation and go for a vote and those types of things, you know, it's a tough issue for them. I mean, they have a hard job because they're dealing with literally hundreds of things simultaneously, and I think the role that we try to play is being helpful to them and educating them on what's happening and how it will affect the industry, and we do the best we can with that.
So Ms. Smith, Boeing being a established contractor for defense, operating in two markets, I would argue, one domestically with Airbus, all that, and then one internationally with Chinese companies and with, I would argue, hostile states. What role do private or public analysts play in informing the design decisions of Boeing's licenses and the marketing decisions, when to reveal something, maybe alter a decision, walk back on something? What role do analysts play in those decisions?
Well, I'm limited in my ability to answer this because it's a pretty technical question, although a great question. What I would say from my window is I know on the defense side, when we market, let's say, our F-18 to an international customer, we are very involved with DoD. I wouldn't necessarily, when you say analyst, I tend to think of government, you know, our government civilians who are going to say things to us like this. Signature for the aircraft is not acceptable to sell internationally. It's too stealthy, and we need you to make it less stealthy if you want to get permission from us to market it internationally. So we will make modifications to the airframe to make it something that DoD will clear. You know, that's something that happens on the defense side. On the commercial side, we really don't tailor the aircraft or design the aircraft with that in mind. We probably keep out technology in the aircraft at the outset we think wouldn't be marketable internationally, but you know, that's a very, or what is in the aircraft that might be sensitive has to be protected in certain ways that I'm not capable of explaining. I know that, for example, avionics is really considered the most sensitive part of the aircraft when you're talking about tech transfer and the possible dual-use technologies associated. I know that the way that we put the avionics together, how it's coded, how it's sealed into the aircraft are all done with a high level of sensitivity with that in mind. But then, of course, when you get down to the really, really bad actors, Iran comes to mind, we're just not going to sell them aircraft, you know. And there are a few places in the world that certainly applies. Fortunately, most of those people can't afford to buy aircraft, so.
Well, I wanted to say thank you. I'm a former NXDC veteran.
Oh.
I deployed in 2013, and I've worked with the FPTs. I'm an aviation technician, so I know firsthand the electronics and the calibration that it takes to, you know, input the test sensitive the cockpit functions F-18. But I wanted to just kind of get, you know, in your experience going to Capitol Hill, what the government does to facilitate Boeing and Lockheed Martin, you know, for defending. You guys are companies who support our military, so I just kind of want to know, you know, your what, you know, how does the government adopt that?
Sure. Well, I did do for a while, when we get into this and we talk through what my path looked like. In the 7 years I've been at Boeing, 3 years I did Navy and Marine Corps programs for Boeing on Capitol Hill before I was in the international job. So it's actually a good question for me. You know, obviously we have platforms and we're very focused on making sure we have line continuity. That's the most important thing to us as a defense contractor, is assurance that we, you know, because when we're building aircraft, we really need assurances that the government's going to buy the aircraft 2 to 3 years out in order for us to purchase the long lead material that goes into building them. And that can be tricky because, you know, year to year the budget changes, and I certainly had years while I was doing the Navy program where there were no F-18s in the budget, and I had to go to the Hill and ask for F-18s to get put back in, which usually meant something was being horse traded to get the F-18s back in. Fortunately for the F-18s and for Boeing and for the Navy, the St. Louis, the Missouri delegation is very effective, and that was their pet project, and they made sure that they took care of us and took care of their line in Missouri, and did a great job, and now the Navy's buying them again, so we're good. We have a multi-year agreement to keep them going. I think, DOD and Capitol Hill are sensitive to that. Like when you have something that's working and you have, work with the contractor to understand what their needs are, what the minimum sustainment rate for different platforms is, and try to hold to that. And that just, it's a budget thing they have to focus on. But by and large, I feel like when we see the budget, it generally takes care of what we absolutely need taken care of to keep our lines open. And I know in the environment we're in today with the budget, that's not always an easy thing. Well, I'm going to get back here.
I got a question about the Star Miner.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, how are we keeping it like ITAR friendly? We're probably getting a lot of these from other places in the world. How are we keeping that?
I'm going to be honest with you. That question probably is over my head. I'm not necessarily an expert in that area. So I'll take that as a go back. If you leave information with Carlos, I'll get you an answer. Okay.
So my question is more about the cybersecurity aspect. I'm not a cybersecurity expert by any means on international relations and all that stuff. But what lessons has the telecommunications industry learned from the Warner Brothers leak, Russian hacks in Europe, in particular financial hacks? What implementations or like what's the level of collaboration not between public entities but other private entities that aren't necessarily within your specific industry?
Yeah, sure. So we do a lot of work with so we have the way we're organized is that each industry sector has what's called an Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or what's an ISAC for short. And that's basically an organization that trades that exchanges cyber threat information within that given industry. And then we have partnerships with similar ISACs for other industries. So for example, the financial services industry has an entity called FSISAC, which is their Information Sharing and Analysis Center that does sharing amongst the banks. And then the banks also have a group called the FSARC, which is, I forget what the acronym is, but it's basically the big 8 financial institutions. So think of companies like Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo. So so our ISAC partners with them as well. So a lot of those companies, it's a weird situation where a lot of those companies, and frankly even companies like Boeing and others,
There's an aviation. I'm used to hearing it called an ISIC.
So we would work with the aviation ISAC. We're actually members of now, we're not just in the comms ISAC. We're members of 6 of them because we were in so many different business spaces. But we all get together and we share information amongst each other about threats. A lot of those companies, quite frankly, are customers of AT&T. I think we serve 999 out of the Fortune 1000. So pretty much all of them are a customer at some level. So in a way, they're our customers as much as our partners when it comes to information sharing. So there is a lot of cross-industry sharing that goes on. And even more specifically, there's a group that was created about 3 years ago called the Tri-Sector Group that's focused on financial, electric, and communications because of the issue of a systemic event occurring that would take out the financial infrastructure or the communications or the power infrastructure, which would be a pretty catastrophic impact on the country. So we created that group to kind of deal with and be prepared for a really bad situation like that occurring. So there's a lot of both collaboration with government, but also across industry that goes on today. And hopefully we're prepared. I mean, we actually just did a joint exercise with MasterCard, basically like a red teaming exercise where we went in and we did a whole couple days where our security team worked with their security team and we tried to look for vulnerabilities and did a lot of we do a lot of these exercises both with the government and within the private industry to be prepared. So a lot of activity going on in that space, and we'd like to think that we're prepared in case if something happens, but you have to be diligent because you never know what's going to hit you in cybersecurity.
Another question?
Yeah, my question, you did mention something with Huawei, and the reason I think they got banned is because there was speculation that if they are insisting there's a way they were collecting data and sharing data.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's why the US and the UK they got banned.
Yeah.
So do you think that if you want to try to create relationship with buying and selling stuff from China, and you want to sell them Huawei, and you say US can buy a product or you can use it, what kind of challenges do you go through on that?
I'm not sure I completely understood what it was you were asking.
In the US, you say you're not gonna buy products from China,
Oh, right.
we can't use Huawei.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
But we still wanna sell them like
Right.
planes and stuff like that.
So I mean, this is the topic of the year, right? This was the administration strategy was to play hardball with them, and Boeing was an interesting experiment in kind on that. You had half the people in my company freaking out, thinking that the company was going to go under because China hasn't taken delivery of a Boeing aircraft in 2 years. It has nothing to do with the MAX. It has nothing to do with coronavirus. It has everything to do with the fact that they were in a trade war with us. And you had people in the company that were like, you need to sit down, be quiet, and have faith that if this administration prevails, that aircraft will be part of the deal. And what they're actually doing is saving us from ourselves, because if they force through a trade deal selling aircraft to China, what that's going to mean is we don't have to move manufacturing over there to sell planes to China. So maybe we'll still be building Boeing aircraft in 20 years and not giving them the keys to the kingdom so Comac can fly, right? In phase one of the trade deal, there's $100 billion of commercial aircraft in there. Now, it's great that it's part of the deal. We need to actually see delivery of those aircraft, but I mean, that is the core of that debate, right? Is the right way to play hardball and to say, we won't buy this if you're not buying that? Does that protect American manufacturing? Does it protect American industry? You know, regardless of your politics, I would think anyone that isn't biased or wants to look at it clear-eyed would say it's too soon to tell. You know, it depends on whether or not some of those deals actually go through and what that looks like. But I can tell you that right now, a lot of the conversation inside Boeing about, you know, this being a crisis is calmed down, because everybody sees that the intent in phase one is to get $100 billion worth of aircraft deals done in short term with China. So I would argue that that's kind of how we look at that world is, well, you know, the hardball is really country to country right now. And our company has observed that as part of their international strategy. This used to be a company to country relationship dynamic where Boeing has people that are living in China that are part of Boeing China, and our typical relationship matrix used to look like people in Boeing China needed to have a relationship with the Chinese government, needed to know what they needed in terms of aircraft sales, have those customer relationships. But that's not really the case anymore, not just for Boeing, but globally. You know, now trade across the world has become a lot more nationalized. And Boeing has to learn how to play within the confines of that and succeed, and have faith that our government's going to look out for U.S. manufacturing. And I feel like that's where we're at right now.
I got a question for you. So you deal with privacy, protection, cybersecurity, and like California passed the CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act, and that like I come from California and I need like AT&T to give me back my data, like I have the right to get that, and you need to comply with that. And this is going around like very soon. New York will come up with their privacy rule, like Florida will have. And so how do you make sure like you comply like each and every state when they come with different like policies and say like that to comply?
Yeah, so the question was, you know, how do we deal with having different privacy statutes state by state, or country by country even around the world, and how do we comply with those? I think for you know, it's a complex issue. Obviously, companies like AT&T, we have a fairly large compliance organization and privacy organization. That's what they do for a living. They monitor these situations and they try to ensure compliance. So we're probably better positioned, I think, than a lot of companies to deal with that. I'm sure Boeing's in the same situation. That, you know, big organizations obviously have more resources to deal with that. But it does create a big challenge. I think, taking off my AT&T hat and thinking more broadly around the industry, you know, certainly we would much prefer a federal approach to these issues so that there's some consistency in how it's handled state by state, so we don't end up with a piecemeal approach of 50 different ways of managing privacy. So that's going to be a challenge. You know, the California statute even the California statute itself is kind of a mess right now, because there's a ballot initiative going on in California that's proposing to make changes to it. There's rules that are going into effect like in a couple months that haven't even been finalized by the California regulators, so we don't even know what we're supposed to comply with because they haven't settled those issues. So there's a lot of confusion, I think, out there, and I think you're right that, you know, California is the first state to do that, and I think it's going to probably be an issue in New York, and it'll probably spread around the country. Just very similar to a data breach. You know, there's 50 states that each have their own data breach laws today. Again, a company like mine, you know, we have a lot of resources put against that, so we have the ability, I think, to to manage that environment. I think it's a difficult issue for folks that don't have the same resources to deal with it, and certainly it would be much easier for industry writ large if there was a common approach.
I do want to close by making sure we learn a little bit more about the two of you. So if you could, briefly share your roles prior to the companies you're with now, what got you to the companies and roles you're in now, and one piece of career advice you have for the group, particularly DC specific career advice, policy oriented career advice, if you have any.
Sure.
You should go first.
Well, I moved up here basically the day after I walked at FIU. I packed up a car and drove up here. I was a political science major and had a job waiting for me and came straight up here. I knew I wanted to be up here. And I did 17 years on Capitol Hill before I went to Boeing to do government relations work. While I was on the Hill, I moved around in different offices, which is a normal experience if you work on Capitol Hill. I started off in the office of a member from Florida, where I did 5 years there. I ended up in the Majority Whip's office for several years, where I was the floor director, which is a good senior leadership job. I was responsible for making sure that bills were passing on the floor. I was responsible for whipping the votes, for negotiating to get votes. And then the last tenure of my time on Capitol Hill, I went to the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, where I was the deputy staff director and policy director, and got to oversee a lot of transportation policy activity. So eventually, my boss at T&I was term limited. I knew I was reaching the end of my Hill tenure. At least I felt like it was time to leave. I hadn't really planned to stay on Capitol Hill that long, but I just kept getting better opportunities on the Hill before I could really think about leaving the Hill. Boeing fell into the right situation. I found the job at the right time, and when I first got to Boeing, I was hired in a strategy role, which is not unusual for people coming right out of government because you have a cooling off period. So I did that for a while, and then eventually I migrated to the legislative affairs team. I started off working commercial issues because that was my area of expertise, but Boeing likes to do what they call stretch assignments for their executives, which means we really want you to learn all areas of the business, and we want you to try different things because it actually opens up your aperture for what we could do with you after that inside the company. So I did Navy and Marine Corps for a while to learn the defense side of the business. I did a stint as the chief of staff for government operations before I landed in the international job, where I now run the international commercial team. I think that pretty much covers it.
For me, it's a long. I would have never thought I would end up in DC, so it's kind of a being in the right place at the right time, or just pure luck. This is how I would spell it out. But no, I started out. So I've been with AT&T almost 27 years. I've been there 26 years now. I started there very similar, like the day after I graduated from college back in the 90s. And when I first started out, I was actually a technician. So I was graduated from school. I found out that Southwestern Bell Telephone Company, which is now AT&T, was hiring people to be a tech and do troubleshooting. I have an MBA in finance. I took a class in telecommunications network infrastructure. I had to take a technical aptitude test. I passed the test, got a job with them. That's how I started working there. And then since that time, I've done a lot of different jobs in the company. I've worked in the network engineering, network planning engineering department. I've worked in the new technology department. I've worked in marketing. So I kind of moved around. I've worked for AT&T, and I started out in St. Louis, Missouri, which is where I grew up. But I also worked for them in Houston, Texas, and San Antonio, Texas, and Dallas. I've worked in the San Francisco Bay Area for a period. I was their policy lead in Silicon Valley for 3 years, and then I came to Washington about 8 or 9 years ago. And it's been we do a lot to develop people and move them around. So I've been fortunate enough that I got put in a lot of positions like that over the years, and got to know a lot of people in the business that are now our senior leadership. I knew a lot of them when they were just entry-level new hire employees back in the day, and so a lot of it just comes down to, I think the biggest advice I would give in a big company like ours is you have to challenge yourself to put yourself out there to try to find the right opportunities, because in an organization of like my organization is 250,000 employees, right? So it's really easy to just get lost in the shuffle and become someone who's just going with the flow. So they always tell us that, you have to manage your own career. So you got to find the right mentors. You've got to find the right projects and the things that resonate with people. And that's partially the company has a responsibility, I think, to develop our people and give you those opportunities at some level. But also the employees have to help themselves too. And I think, we do a lot. Like one of the things that I was really proud of that AT&T's done recently is we did a training and retraining program for a lot of our legacy employees where for cybersecurity, for example, we have about 5 or 6 different technology areas that we know we need more people in. Cybersecurity is one. There's other areas as well, computer programming, software, design and development. We have a lot of people that did traditional telecommunications stuff that, frankly, is a declining part of our business now. And we're moving more into being a technology company. We need more people like that. So the company has put together partnerships with universities and other places around to try to develop that workforce and retrain those people so they continue to have opportunities. So there's a lot about, so in a company like mine, there's a lot of opportunity for people who want to come in and want to learn and be continually learning and moving to different parts of the company. But you have to take ownership of that. That's the biggest advice I would give you.
Advice. So my piece of advice is this. Doing work for government, whether it's in the administration or it's on the Hill, it's like an advanced degree in this city. And it's a degree that without it, your career trajectory can be somewhat limiting if government relations is what you're interested in. And I say that, there is definitely a route to come up as a subject matter expert, but I bet you would agree with me that that tends to be, it's less common if you're in DC to come up through that route. And what I see happen a lot, especially inside Boeing, is, if you go right out of your college activity, whether it's out of your bachelor's, whether it's out of your master's, and you go to a private sector job, what will happen is you'll get a job there, entry-level-ish, and then you're going to hit a point where if you're interested in government relations, you kind of stagnate. And the problem is you're going to be competing with people for external hires that actually are coming in from off Capitol Hill or from out of government. And there is an invaluable amount of, that's the wrong way to say it, there is a high level of value on government experience if what you want to do is government relations in DC. And what I would say is recognize that you will be priced out of that pretty quickly. If you go to the private sector first, you will have to take a pay cut to go do government work. Government work is a lot more palatable when you do it right out of Capitol or right out of your degree field, and you don't need to stay in it long. 2 or 3 years is plenty enough to have it on your resume and be able to say, I was part of it, I understood how it worked, whether it was on the Hill or whether it was in the administration or in an agency. And for some of us, myself included, I went into it and I kept making more money and I kept moving up the chain. And while I didn't really understand I could make a lot more money when I was ready to leave, I was happy enough and I loved my job, so I just kept going and ended up spending a lot of time up there. And it worked out well because the more time you put in, the more value you have to the private sector community in this area of government relations. So my advice is take a very hard look at government work right out of the gate when you're done with your degree. I'm sure there will be private sector opportunities that appeal, but if what you want is government relations, your runway is going to be a lot longer and a lot clearer if you do that work first.
Yeah, I totally concur with that. That's why I said earlier, it's kind of like being in the right place at the right time for me, because I started out on the business side of AT&T and ended up in policy. I could count on one hand the number of people in my office out of the hundreds of people that work there and that I've come across over the years in government relations jobs that actually have that type of background. There's always a need, I think, to have people that have a good business background to be working with the government team, and that's kind of, and it's not I would say it's not unusual that someone like me leads the technology team because I know the technology. I used to work in the technology place, part of the company. But that's one job, like very small group of I have 6 people that are on my team, right? So we don't have a big organization. The rest of the people in the Washington office that are not technologists, the people that handle the lobbyists that handle Capitol Hill, the folks that interact with the Federal Communications Commission, they all are people that have worked in government jobs previously, almost up to a T. So I definitely agree with that. If you want to get in government relations, in fact, when I hire people on my own team, I typically hire people out from government or from other companies that worked in government previously. It's very rare for us to bring somebody internally inside the company to Washington simply because of the amount of time it would take them to get up to speed. And if they're business people, they usually want to go back and do a business job eventually. So by the time they become a known quantity and they're someone that the government views as credible and has relationships, they're going to want to cycle back to their old job, at which point I just spent 2 years getting somebody up to speed and they're no longer going to be doing that role. So it's usually, it's very rare, I think, for people to come out of the business and move in that role. We do try to do some of that because we do need some expertise, but not to say the other folks don't gain that expertise, but it's just a different world, right? So I totally agree with that. And then I think if you want to go into a traditional business job, as I was saying earlier, you have to take ownership of it because it really is, at least in big companies. I can't speak for smaller ones. I've never worked for companies smaller than AT&T, which is one of the 10 largest companies in the world. So it makes it, I'm a little biased, but in a big company like mine, it is easy to get lost in the shuffle, and you have to kind of put yourself out there.
Okay. I'd like to personally thank you both. I'd also like to call up Carlos to thank you both as well before we...
If I may. Well, I want to thank both Chris and Amy. This is quite informative, and I want to thank this crew. They've experienced some advocacy visits already. A third of them will be visiting Senator Rubio's team tomorrow. We visited Congresswoman Shalala's team and Congressman Chris. But already, I know I was with this group, you'd be proud of them, Amy, and Chris, I'm sure, too. They were really digging in on some of these issues and engaging on the policy process. But I want to thank you both. And to reiterate the power of our alumni network, both of these individuals are here because of that alumni network. Amy Smith herself, I think, is testament to someone who landed here. We won't say how long, right? We've agreed to that? All right. Whatever we're doing these days. But from day one, she has always looked out for FIU grads and FIU students. It is funny that we are joined by the Honors College crew, Dean J.C. Espinosa, because Amy took pride every year for how many years?
Oh my gosh, for like a decade. It was like a decade. You guys would come through here, and I would always come and speak to the class. And yes, and then I feel like it fell off for a while.
Well, now it's back. Thanks to this gentleman, because I do want to give a shout out to Dean Espinosa, has been one of our critical partners.
I know exactly when it stopped because my last time doing that, I remember being here and trying to explain to the class what I was doing at Boeing. I had just accepted the job. It hadn't started yet, so it was 7 years ago.
There you go.
Well, I'll be calling on you.
Dean Espinosa has been critical. The Honors College is one of our core partners. Also here today is Dr. Arvind Agrawal, leading a lot of our cold spray research. The students have met him earlier and have visited in his lab, but I wanted you both to be aware of him. And Chris, yourself, one of Chris's colleagues, J.C. Flores, proud FIU alumnus, plays more of a public affairs role up here, right?
Yeah. So JC is kind of my partner on a lot of these 5G issues. We work very closely together every day.
Exactly. And JC is Mr. FIU. Once again, as you experience these next 2 days, those that really peak and you prioritize coming back here, it's because of individuals like this and new friends like Chris that we're going to really be able to help propel your careers, and we commit to that. You were going to.
I was going to ask you if JC was in college with us as well, or is he a younger set?
A few years after. So that's about it from me. And Eric?
That's about it from me too. So we're about to transition to a lovely reception with some more alumni and friends joining us, and we certainly look forward to that. Thank you both again.
I'm not sure.
I guess starting all right. And then the last thing is that's what I was interested in.
I've heard this.
I want to do
JC
Yeah.